Hi everyone in English 2323, it's Dr. E and I'm here with your week 8 supplemental video. So in this video my plan is to just kind of go over a few things from what we've read, what we are reading this week, and kind of make some connections because that's what I'm essentially going to ask you to do in this week's written response. So I have a kind of slideshow that I'm just going to walk through with some really interesting facts. Stevenson and Doyle always kind of take me down a rabbit hole when it comes to just researching because they're interesting characters with interesting characters. So I'm just going to jump right into it and we'll start with a discussion of Doyle. So I really want us to kind of dig into our memories and think back to The Adventure of the Speckled Band and think about Doyle as we are finishing up our reading on Stevenson this week. Okay, so here's Doyle, handsome fella. All right, so we really want to think about the time period, in which he lived. We are still working in the Victorian era, right? So he was born in 1859, passed away in 1930. He is Scottish, so I think a lot of times people tend to think of Doyle as English, right? But he's from Scotland. He was born in Edinburgh. He was born to an affluent family. He earned a medical degree, right, which is something that we definitely see sparks of in his writing in the story, especially in terms of Watson and the character of Sherlock Holmes, right? And he became a spiritualist, which was really common at this time in the late 19th century. This is a time period where people are questioning spirituality in general. They're holding seances. They are thinking about the veil between the living and the dead. It's a really interesting time period when you consider those things and the development of spiritualism in general, and he was himself a spiritualist. So again, interesting character, right? All right, and if we go to Sherlock Holmes as a character, we do have a quote here where while a medical student, Conan Doyle was deeply impressed by the skill of his professor, Joseph Bell, right? We should be familiar with this from our biography, in observing the most minute detail regarding a patient's condition, right? So we see glimpses of that in Sherlock Holmes as a character, and that was certainly Doyle's intention. So I put, is it Holmes or is it Bell? So Holmes's physical characteristics were similar to those of Bell, who is described as thin, wiry, dark, with a high-nosed, acute face, penetrating gray eyes, angular shoulders, and a jerky way of walking. His voice was high and discordant. So hopefully that gives you kind of an image of what Holmes as a character is supposed to look like, how he's supposed to move, so that in your mind's eye, when you think of Sherlock Holmes, that's what Doyle intended, right? And we have references for where these quotes come at the bottom. All right, so The Adventure of the Speckled Band was written in 1892, one of his first, right? Serialized, right? Which means it was published in a magazine and it was considered a locked room mystery. So when we talk about serialized work, if you're not familiar with the idea of it, this was something that was really common in the late 19th century because not everybody had access to buying books. Book publishing was growing, right, and becoming a real kind of industry. But people bought newspapers. Newspapers were much more readily available, much more affordable. So people would publish their work in serialized format. So take it in chapters or chunks, right? And this week we get this part of the story. This week we get the next part. I mean, that's how Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was serialized every week and then collected into a full text to be published, as a single unit. Okay, and it was considered a locked room mystery. This should be something that makes sense to you, right? Given the text and how the mystery actually unfolds in terms of how did this happen if the room was locked, right? All right, so I want us to think about some literary terms, right, as we're kind of moving through our ideas this week and moving forward. So genre is, very basic in terms of literary term. So it's a kind of literature. So when we're thinking about examples, we have comedy, mystery, tragedy, satire, elegy, romance, all of these kinds of things, right? So Alistair Fowler uses the following elements to define genre. So the organizational features, how is it set up, right? The length, the mood. So for example, the Gothic novel is moody and dark, right? Whereas something from a different era might be just a little more lighthearted, right? So thinking back to the Romantic era, even though, Tennyson may not have been writing in the Romantic era, he was writing back to it, but that is certainly not dark and moody, right? It was very much fairy tale-esque, it was picturesque, it was idyllic, that kind of thing. Okay. Style, the text can be high, low, or in between depending on its audience. High being high-browed, right? Written in a very complex manner. Low to more average readers, that kind of thing. What the reader's role may be. So, genre plays a pretty important role in how we as an audience view a text. And it's a choice made by the author, right? To write in a particular kind of genre. Okay, give me 1 second. Let me pause. My computer is... No, sorry about that. Adobe had to force quit. Anyhow, so moving from genre into some actual clipping or information from newspapers. First published in the Strand magazine with illustrations by Sidney Paget, right? So the Strand magazine, was a pretty popular magazine from the time, and that's where the text was serialized. The alternative title was The Spotted Band, which again should make some sense, right? ACD, Arthur Conan Doyle referred to the story as a thriller in a letter to his mom, and he considered it the best of his series with Sherlock Holmes. So when asked by Mortimer Mempes which was his favorite, he replied, "Perhaps the one about the serpent, but I can't for the life of me remember the name of it." That just tickles me. So he identified it as one of his favorite. It's one of his earliest, though, later in life he couldn't recall the name. That shows you how many stories he actually wrote, right? All right, so characterization is another pretty common term when we're thinking about writing about literature, and so this is the ways individual characters are represented by the narrator or author of a text. So we're thinking descriptions, right, physical appearances, so going back to that description of Dr. Bell and how that added to the characterization of Holmes, personalities, actions, interactions, and dialogue. Again, we really want to think about the fact that behind all these terms that we're thinking about is an author making those specific choices. Doyle chose to make Holmes kind of the living embodiment of Dr. Bell on paper, right, on the page. So he was making intentional decisions that we want to think about and credit when we're writing about literature. Doyle wrote this. Doyle created this character. Doyle identifies or describes, so let's get into the habit of that language because it's a bit different than other kinds of writing, right? All right, so when we're thinking about characters and characterization, authors are intentional, right? So think about how Sherlock Holmes is written in The Adventures of the Speckled Band compared to Watson, compared to Helen Stoner, right? And then think of Grimesby Roylott. I love the names that Holmes chooses because Grimesby just really, it gives us a sense of the character before we even know too much about his characterization, right? Grimesby, I don't know, it just tickles me. All right, so going into Stevenson, right? This devil right here, this handsome devil. So the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written around the same time period because they lived around the same time period. Stevenson born a little bit after and dying a little bit after. Oh, I'm sorry, he died before. Doyle died in 1930, right? So 1850 to 1894, he, was not well for much of his life, so he did not have a long life. Born in Scotland, also Edinburgh, so they're born in the same place. He studied to be a barrister, which just is the British term for lawyer. Unwell for much of his life, and for his health, he traveled abroad, right, to get some relief. So it was Dr. Jekyll, both moral, allegory, and thriller, that established his reputation with the ordinary reader. So this text was really kind of foundational in people's broader understanding of Stevenson at this time. This is what brought some attention to Stevenson as a writer. And it is considered an allegory, which is a literary mode that attempts to convert abstract concepts, values, beliefs, or historical events into characters or other tangible elements. So examples include Gulliver's Travels, The Fairy Queen, Pilgrim's Progress, or Paradise Lost, where you have characters like man, right? So allegory is taking these big ideas and putting them into a more approachable kind of dynamic, a more approachable kind of story. And so we can see Jekyll and Hyde in that way because good and evil. One character can be seen as good, one character can be seen as evil or menacing or, negative, positive, that kind of thing. All right, so the names of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the two alter egos, have become shorthand for the exhibition of wildly contradictory behavior, especially between private and public selves, right? So this text and these characters have really moved beyond the pages and become just part of our everyday lexicon and thinking. We hear people reference Jekyll and Hyde often, right? When we're thinking about if somebody has like a bad day, they're turning into Jekyll and Hyde. Oftentimes people mistake and they say oh, it's that Jekyll, that person's, that's their Dr. Jekyll side. When we know it's actually Hyde, right? That is the negative, that is the more malicious character as part of that. Okay, I'm gonna have to pause again because Adobe is going to quit. Oh boy, okay, let's try this in PowerPoint and see if that works a bit more. So as I was saying, people reference Jekyll and Hyde often and mistakenly, right? They'll say Jekyll when they actually mean Hyde. And the same is true for something like Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, people talk about, oh, that's Frankenstein, or that person as being a Frankenstein, like a monster. But when it's Frankenstein's monster, the Dr. Frankenstein actually created the monster. Anyhow, randomness. So going back to the idea of characterization, we have Gabriel Utterson, which, again, the name, just like with Doyle, pretty interesting because Utterson is who we really see the story through. He utters, right? He's the speaker in some ways. And then we have Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde. So we have Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. This is perhaps one of my favorite descriptions of all time when it comes to literature because it just seems so contradictory and interesting. So a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Okay, cold, scanty, this seems like a person you may not want to know. Backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. Oh, Stevenson, you crack me up. All right, so when Lanyon describes Jekyll, but it's more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful, right? Too fancy for me. He began to go wrong in mind. And though, of course, I continue to take an interest in him for old time's sake, as they say, I see and I have seen devilish little of the man, which is interesting. Devilish little, right? Such unscientific balderdash, added the doctor, flushing and suddenly purple, would have estranged Damon and Pythias, right? So we have some allusions there. So think, look that up, look up the allusions there. And then Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness. So Stevenson is really descriptive when it comes to establishing his characters, using characterization to help the audience really get a sense of these different men, right? Especially when it comes to the various differences between Jekyll and Hyde. And then we have duality and dichotomy. So the story has long been interpreted as a representation of the Victorian's bifurcated self, right? Torn down the middle in some ways. Jekyll is in every way a gentleman, but just beneath the surface lie baser desires that remain unspoken. He is the very personification of the dichotomy between outward gentility and inward lust, right? So we have that dueling difference, that dichotomy, right? Two different things. We see Jekyll and Hyde throughout the years in various it's a story, it's a tale that we see in various iterations, right? Even in The Nutty Professor. And then we see the same with Sherlock Holmes. If y'all have not watched the Sherlock from the BBC, oh my gosh, please do. It's amazing. But this one with Robert Downey Jr. and dude right here, what's his name? Whew, had to look it up. Jude Law. My brain is broken in some ways. All right, and then finally we have women, right? So we're dealing with male writers not writing about female characters. So we have this CBS version of Elementary where Watson is a woman. And then of course we have Enola Holmes, which is a Netflix film.